thinking about, educating the public and raising awareness, positively changing social norms and attitudes. And that means, how we think about victims and survivors is greatly impacted by the media. Media can definitely help seek justice for survivors in the community, and it can gain support for them, often in material ways, such as raising money to pay for a funeral or for other costs. And the media can also help push for systemic change. If a community does not understand how the trauma around, say, unsolved homicides is having lasting and long-term effects, then there will be very little push to change that, how cases are investigated, how cases are handled, how we all respond to them. The media also, as I will admit, can perpetuate myths and misinformation, especially in facts about cases that can be really difficult for families. It can put information out there that can be very harmful for survivors and for families that they would rather not be in the public realm but are also in public records. And it can certainly add to trauma experienced by victims, families, and the community. It can do that by being insensitive about how the media talks about cases. It can also do that by showing and repeating things that are traumatizing to children in the community. So I think one of the things as a victim or survivor serving agency that people can do is, as best they can in the time that they encounter survivors, is kind of prepare them for the choices that they might have to make. A lot of people that I have encountered in terms of doing news stories over the years, they're not savvy about the media. They're not prepared to deal with the media. And in fact, they're kind of at the worst point in their life. So they're not thinking about what role the media may or may not play. That's changed a little bit over the years. People are thinking a little bit more about it now because of social media, but it's still not the first thing on someone's mind when something horrific happens in their life. So just simply kind of explaining to people who you might be dealing with what information about their case could be published or broadcast, letting them know what types of things reporters look at and report on, whether you agree with what they're going to do or not, just kind of giving people a heads up that what they could see. There could be details of a crime. There could be an address of a house. Just knowing that stuff in advance sometimes can help. Having a plan to respond to media. So just kind of simply saying to someone on the front end, people are going to come and try to talk to you. How do we want to handle that? Do you want someone to speak for you? Do you want to not speak at all? And a lot of times in the past, people would say, well, I don't want to speak to the media. And someone who works with victims or survivors might be able to say, well, whether or not you want to speak to the media, they still may come to your house or knock on your door or your window. So the best way to maybe keep them from, invading your privacy again and again might be to have a sign in your car that you can hand to them and say, go ahead and tape this to the window. And the sign could just very simply ask for privacy at this time and say, please do not knock. Just something like that might avoid someone from having, 5 different members of the media knock on their door at a time when they're really craving some privacy. Also, if people have something they want to say, but they're not exactly sure how to say it, you could be real helpful in helping them craft a statement that includes things that they do want to share, but also then asks for privacy so that people don't keep coming and asking them questions. So I think those are kind of the basic things that I would suggest to people to think about having kind of in their wheelhouse for when they respond to help crime victims or survivors. Deciding to talk with the media could be a big thing. That has a lot to do with timing as well. So I think there's some questions that you could talk to a victim or survivor about to see if talking to the media will help them achieve what they're hoping to achieve. So do they have kind of an immediate goal? Do they want to get some information out there because they're hoping a perpetrator gets caught? Have they been told by law enforcement that maybe they shouldn't talk because it might be harmful to an investigation? And do they believe that to be the case? Do they believe that that's true and accurate? knowing what type of story the media wants to do. You know, is this a story on an event that just occurred yesterday and they're asking them to respond immediately, or is this a story that is looking at the victim experience or a survivor experience that might be more in-depth and long-term, and are they ready to handle that? One of the other things that I think is always kind of probably should be at the top of the list instead of at the bottom of the list there is, are there any safety concerns for family members or those who might be interviewed? You know, we're talking about people's homes and their neighborhoods that could be identified, and checking to make sure that someone isn't at risk for, you know, retaliation or something like that is really important, because the safety aspect should always come first. There's, of course, more considerations than would fit on one slide. So getting a little bit more in-depth with family members or survivors about what could happen if they speak to the media can be helpful. They need to know that a reporter is likely to include information that didn't directly come from them. They'll include information that came from police or public records, like a police report, and the survivor or family may agree with that information or disagree with that information, but they deserve to know that it could be there. This is one thing that I've run into a lot lately, and so I think that it's definitely something that people might want to consider. Oftentimes media, whether online media or television media, one of the first things they'll do is ask for a photo of a victim or to get a photo of survivors. And that's often something that people do like to provide, because it really shows people the human side of what has happened. But that photo can also be rerun or re-aired or shared with other media and used by maybe media outlets that the family wishes that it wasn't. And so knowing in advance that that could be an issue, I think, can be helpful in making that decision. And also, you know, a family member can say, I'm going to provide this photo, but I'm only providing it to you, and it's restricted to be used by you. They might not often know that they can do that. Talking to families ahead of time a little bit about what they want the public to know or understand about their loved one. You know, oftentimes reporters are trying to get facts, you know, what somebody knew about a case or a situation, but also talking to a family about, you know, the things that memories that they have about a loved one that they might want to share that they're thinking about at that time. Can be good things to share with the media if they don't really want to get into the details of the case, but they really want to represent who their loved one was. Also, you know, family members or survivors that could be part of any kind of criminal case should know that if they're making statements in the media and they're making factual statements about a loved one that they lost, that could be seen as evidence to law enforcement, prosecutors, defense attorneys. So whether or not they have firsthand knowledge of something that happened, if they're repeating things, that could be something that they could be, you know, called about to testify, and so that's another consideration. One of the things that a lot of victims and survivors that I've worked with over the years don't know is that they can ask the media questions as well. And I think this can really empower victims and survivors in making their decisions and making decisions that are good for them. They can ask folks in the media when a story will air or when it will appear in the paper, what types of details might be included. You know, what kind of story is this? Is this just a story about the crime, or is this a story talking about the life of my loved one? How will they be identified or not identified if they give an interview? Can they give an interview that uses their name and age but doesn't give their location if they're nervous about that? They can ask who else might be interviewed for the story. You know, will someone who maybe they're not comfortable with be interviewed that also knows the survivor or the victim? And also a lot of times people want to know whether information can be included on funeral funds or family fundraising efforts. And I would be real clear with folks that that they don't have to agree to talk for a story for that information to be included. I have seen some, let's say, unseemly reporters kind of make it seem like if they want this information out there so that they can raise funds, that they need to kind of cooperate and give an interview. And that's not the case. Most people will print and publish that information and link to it anyway from a story. And a family member or survivor could also say, I'd like you to include this, but I don't really want to make any comment at this point, and still ask that. Okay. One question that I get a lot from family and survivors is that can I read the story, or can I see the video that you're going to post before it's published? So that for most media, in many cases, is an ethical thing that they cannot do. They can't have prior review of a story. But there are many different situations. For instance, if I work with survivors who are very, very young, I act differently than if I'm reporting on the mayor of a city who knows how the media works. And so I may show them a little bit or talk them a little bit more through a story that will be published so that they're comfortable and they understand the process. But any victim or survivor can ask, how will I be quoted in the story? So basically, what things that I said are you going to use? And it's perfectly okay to ask about that. Or, what portion of my interview will be aired? What photo or video will be used with my interview? That's another thing that's perfectly fine to ask. And then I think is okay to help victims and survivors feel comfortable about how the process is going for them. And if you do have, a victim or survivor that decides that they do want to do an interview with the media, and that you do get a chance to talk to them about it ahead of time, I think that there's a number of ways in which you can kind of prep them to do that. I think often if you're not used to working with the media and you get into that situation where you're in an interview, you might forget some of these things. So I often tell people to kind of jot down a list. That's one of the last things that I have on the slide, to write down to write down thoughts that they hope to convey. And that's the same both for, facts about a loved one or memories of a loved one, as it also is about a timeline. If someone's gone through a trauma that they've experienced or something they've witnessed, sitting down to talk to a reporter is difficult in the first place, but then conveying thoughts in the chronological way that reporters write and that stories are constructed can be especially difficult and frustrating. So writing down those things ahead of time can be really helpful. Having survivors, families, victims know that they could have an advocate or support person with them in an interview is helpful. Knowing that they're not doing that alone can provide a lot of support. Knowing that they have the opportunity not to answer every single question that a reporter asks, and even this is something that I've seen people practice, especially if they're going to do maybe a television interview. Tell them that they can kind of decline to answer a question that they don't feel is a question that they should have to answer. And I've actually worked with some survivors that were going to do bigger interviews, and they came up with a signal because they were worried that they wouldn't be able to tell someone that they wanted to stop an interview. So they came up with a signal just to kind of raise their hand if they needed to stop the interview for any reason, or if they just needed to take some time to gather themselves if they were feeling very emotional. One of the other things, again, reminding survivors to get ready for an interview is about sharing concerns about safety and what things about them or their family that they were comfortable identifying or not, both either on camera if it's a television interview or in print if it is a written or an online story using words. For instance, one of the things that I've talked to people about is if you have a incident that's a domestic violence type situation, identifying where a family was and where they've moved to, or if they're staying at a relative's house, can be a danger. And so we've talked about that with folks ahead of time. And oftentimes people will, again, not used to working with the media, they just not want to give information, but if they're helped to explain why they don't want to give information, it's often helpful so that the person who's doing the story understands exactly what that risk might be. So whether the concern is something that they personally have because they're worried, which is a really, usually when people are worried, there's a really good reason, or if there's a specific threat they need to be aware of, so that way if information comes to them from another source, they don't share information that they shouldn't. Some simple tips for preparing survivors for an interview can be discussing what they feel comfortable talking about ahead of time, asking them whether they want to describe, what they've experienced. So if a family member has witnessed some violence, do they want to talk about that if they are asked, or would they prefer to stick to just talking about their loved one, or maybe what the fallout of a crime has been on their family in terms of their emotions or financially, and maybe they want to avoid talking about something that they witnessed that was traumatic. And so knowing that before an interview starts can be really helpful. They can ask to talk to, a television reporter kind of off camera first to get details straight, and then only talk on camera about the things they're comfortable with. If victims or survivors are really young, reporters often can make accommodations as long as they clear it with their editors to shield an identity. So on television, you might see that as kind of putting a shadow over someone's face. For young people in particular, they're often more willing to do that or to use a pseudonym for a child than they are for an adult. And if the story is really more about the experience of being a victim or a survivor of trauma, I think that, a direct interview can often be really difficult, but sharing things that were already done with a victim support agency, either therapy, art, writing, music, things like that, if those are available and the victim or survivor has already participated in that, sharing those kind of things can be a great way to get across what they're hoping to without having to have a completely separate experience with a totally different set of questions and expectations. When I first started doing this, we did not have to really worry about online considerations because I would go out often at night or early in the morning and talk to families about having lost a loved one. I would go back to work, I would file my story, and it would appear in the paper the next day. We did not, when I started, have all of our stories posted online. We did not share all of our stories with social media. So that has really changed what we do, and it's changed how it can affect victims and survivors and family members. So for them to know how that works, at least a little bit, or for you to know so that you can help them consider it can be helpful. So, I work for the Plain Dealer in Cleveland. And the Plain Dealer in Cleveland does stories that appear in the Plain Dealer, online on cleveland.com, on a Facebook website for each, and also on Twitter, sometimes Reddit. And other papers or websites across the country can pick up those stories and also write about them and attribute them to us. The same thing is true with television and radio. They share with stations across the country, and those stories can appear on their websites. So if people live in a city like Cleveland, but they have family in Alabama, those family members may see those stories, and they didn't know that that would happen, and they need to know that. Just, it's a consideration that's worth sharing. On the websites themselves, people often can comment on stories, and commenters are not often the kindest people, especially if they're anonymous. The same happens when stories are shared on social media. This is something that I really, really wish we had some control over, but most media outlets, despite lots and lots of shouting by reporters, don't have a lot of control over this. The best thing that we can do is try to delete comments where people are being nasty or insensitive or racist or inaccurate. But not all websites do that. Some websites leave up every comment, and it's kind of a free-for-all. So if you're working with a victim or survivor or family that has a story that might draw those kind of comments, it's worth having a conversation with them, because if they don't want to deal with that, then maybe it's better not to participate, or to ask the the media agency whether they can shut off those comments for that story or whether they plan to moderate them closely so that the family doesn't have to deal with what some people's opinions might be. I've had situations where we're doing kind of bigger stories, less likely to be kind of a daily story, where advocates and or survivors can prepare for this and they can respond in the comments. They'll log in just like anybody else and either respond to inaccuracies or share their own perspective. I have to honestly say I have not had the best experience with that. I think that some people go into the comments, whether or not they're a trained advocate or survivor or family member, thinking if they're very genuine and they're sharing their perspective that people will be kind to them and understand. And that's just not the type of folks that I have tended to see on some of these online forums. We often joke that most of the people who participate, unfortunately, live in a basement somewhere and only wear sweatpants. So that's something, again, I wish we could change, but since we can't change it on a whole, I think letting people who participate in the media know about it is the next best thing that we can do. Some more specific ways to prepare, So we talked a little bit about preparing victims or survivors or family members for an interview. But if you start to have relationships with reporters, or even if you just first meet a reporter and you feel that the interview that's being done is going to be either really important or possibly even detrimental for a survivor that wants to do one, I think there are ways that you can prepare reporters either gently or very overtly to interview a survivor. And I recommend this not because it's your job to train reporters for anything, but just knowing that a lot of times reporters, get in a position where they're doing these very, very serious stories and they have such little training on how to respond it that they actually appreciate a little bit of help and some reminders. When I first started interviewing victims and survivors, I didn't realize that sometimes the best thing for me to do was to keep my mouth closed, look at them directly in the eye and nod as they talked, and not interrupt them as they try to tell their story. Just let them tell it in the way that they were able to, and then wait until the end to maybe ask some questions or clarify what they were saying. And the other thing that I didn't know that I've definitely learned over time and has been helpful is to realize the different ways in which people will react to trauma. As a reporter, we are trained to watch people and to see how they are responding to things. And just like anybody else that doesn't have training in trauma, if something doesn't seem right to us, we don't really know how to take that in or how to describe it. We expect people to be crying and upset because that's kind of how we're trained and we're brought up. So if we see someone that has a kind of flat affect, or someone who's kind of giggling or nervous, or has a reaction that we don't expect, and we can be taught to expect that, then we maybe won't include something in a story that really kind of is an inappropriate way of us understanding what's happening. I teach at Kent State University, and one of the things I teach my students is when they do their section on courtroom reporting, I always tell them that, you can observe what happens in a courtroom, and you can observe how, maybe a defendant is reacting to information, but you can't say how they feel based on that reaction. So if you see a defendant who is sobbing, that doesn't mean that they're remorseful, and the defendant who is sitting there not making a sound, staring straight forward, is not remorseful, because all you're seeing is their outside reaction. And that's the same in working with victims and survivors. Depending on what they've already been through or how they've been treated, their reactions can be different. Knowing all that can be really helpful for reporters if they haven't really done a ton of reporting. We'll talk a little bit about ways in which you can be a conduit, a trusted conduit for both reporters and for survivors. And I don't know, I didn't see the list. I don't know if we have any Cleveland folks on the webinar today, but I wanted to bring up a really good example of, I think, how this was done in Cleveland with a colleague of mine, Bree Zeltner, and someone that works for one of our victim and survivor serving agencies here that's a grantee. We had a young woman who was killed. She was 14 years old, and she was abducted as she was taking a bus to school. And, you know, in our community, and as I think in many communities, you know, when someone dies like this, people respond with, you know, you can see in the picture the balloons and the teddy bears and things like that. And there's a feeling that that is what people want. But in this case, the family very much did not want their child to be remembered at this place where she died. It was very harmful to them and very hurtful to them. And so, you know, they weren't at a point where they wanted to call a press conference and talk about that, but they were able to go to their trusted advocate with the agency, have the advocate, you know, reach out to us and say, please, please, please get the word out that this is not what this family wants, and that this is actually causing them a lot of stress, and that they would rather their child be remembered somewhere where she was happy and not in this place. So that's just one example of, I think, the way that that can work. So you can be a conduit if survivors or family members have information they want to share, but talking directly to the media might just be too difficult to them, either because of the timing or because of some of the other factors that we talked about before about safety. You can be the person that reaches out with a family photo or a specific anecdote a family wants to share. A number of times I've had someone reach out to me with some biographical details or a memory that a family wanted to share to correct fact errors. This is a really common thing where police or the court system will give out information that they have in their records about a victim, and the family says it absolutely isn't correct, and it really is bothersome to them. We actually had this happen a couple times where, you know, the family had just way different information than the police did, and in one case, you know, it was about someone's gender. And so we were able to write a story that was more correct than what the public records were putting out there based on someone reaching out to us on behalf of the family. I've seen this done in a couple ways. You know, generally we're moving pretty fast with initial stories, so it could often be a phone call. But we've also had families do written and or, this is kind of a more recent thing, a video statement if the family wants to say something in their own words. Recording a statement and then sharing that with a bunch of different media entities so that they can use that statement and have it be the same statement everywhere. Some things to think about is making it clear exactly where the information is coming from. So is this information directly attributable to a family member, and if so, who, and making sure their name is spelled correctly? Or is this coming from the advocate on behalf of the family, and who that person is, and also making sure their name is spelled correctly. Understanding kind of media deadlines and news cycle deadlines. We're kind of in a 24-hour world now, but for television, there might be, you know, a deadline to hit the 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or 11 o'clock news if a family wants a statement to be out there. And also the consideration of who to send information to. Does information go to a specific member of the media, a specific television station or newspaper, or does the agency have a list of people that they can share it with if the family would like the information to be shared widely, either because they want it to be out there or because they're hoping that the other people then don't all try to contact them and get the information. So as I mentioned earlier, having kind of an agency protocol or set of guidelines in advance can really help with this. Because I think each agency has their own set of, you know, ethical and other guidelines that they want to make sure that they're following, and making sure that they get permission to share things in the appropriate way. And, you know, sometimes people have paperwork they have to fill out around that in other ways. some people are dealing with HIPAA type things, and so I just think knowing all of that in advance can help when you get into a situation where you have something you want to share, but you want to be able to do it in a way that you know that you're allowed to. Kind of a word of warning, some advocates who know members of the media can feel comfortable if they want to talk off the record to a reporter, either ahead of an interview to discuss information that's sensitive to a case, whether an open case or an unsolved case. Those conversations should always be with a survivor or family member's knowledge. They should know that you're talking in that way with a reporter. There's got to be a really, really clear understanding of what that means. If you're talking to someone, and I use like the air quotes, off the record, does that mean that nothing that you say to them can ever be reported or published or verified? Or does that mean, I want to share this information with you, but you can't attribute it to me or to the family? So just making sure that's really clear can help avoid misunderstandings and mistakes that can be harmful to the family members or even harmful to investigations that are going on around some of these situations. So, all right, I'm taking a real quick deep breath because we're going through this fast, and I'm really, really sorry if I'm talking quickly. I'm hoping that we'll have time at the end for some questions and some answers on this, and I think that we will. Working with media, especially if you're in a community and you have an agency that's going to be there long-term and wants to have relationships, can be really helpful. And the media is often moving very quickly. Sometimes reporters change out, and so those relationships can be difficult to maintain. But there are some things that you can do, I think, to build these relationships over time that will not only help your agency, help the people you serve, but also help the wider community understand what the people that you serve go through and what needs they have in the community and how they can support those needs. One of my favorite things that I have forged over the years with agencies that I cover is that I try to get invited to their trainings. So if, the Rape Crisis Center is doing a trauma training, or if the city is doing a training on recognizing signs of trauma for people that work in its rec centers, I always try to get invited to those things, because if I am learning what the staff members are learning, I can then incorporate that into my stories, because things change, reactions to things change, the way that the community is responding to things change. And if I know that, it can really help me do my job. It also gives me a chance in a situation that is not a new situation to get to know the people working for that agency, to talk to them about concerns they have, things that they may see that are not getting covered appropriately. I often walk away from those things with ideas of stories that I should be doing that I'm not. So I think there's a lot of reasons to do something like that. If your agency isn't real comfortable inviting reporters in to do training with you, you could offer, if you have the time and the funds to do a quick kind of lunchtime brown bag for reporters or editors or news directors to kind of tell them what you do and just give them a little bit of training from your perspective and how you work with victims and survivors and families. You can do that in a half an hour or 45 minutes and just kind of go over some of the things that not only that you hope that they know, but that they might not know and you feel that they need to know. And that can kind of spark a relationship where they can call upon you when they have stories that might need some of that information. And you can call upon them in situations that you think might need a little bit more sensitivity, or where a family really needs a story to be told. So those are places to kind of build those relationships. I know that a lot of victim and survivor and family serving agencies don't have huge budgets, and the budgets that you do have go for case management and for really doing direct services to families and survivors and victims. But providing some kind of bare bones statistics on your website can be really, really helpful. A lot of times media is trying to add context to stories and they're trying to do it really quickly. So if you have local statistics on how many people access your services, how many people in the community have gotten counseling for a trauma where you work. That can be really helpful, and those things will be included in stories. One of the other things that I would say is make sure on your website where your staff members are listed, if their names are there, that they're spelled correctly and that they're updated and that they have the correct titles. I often hear from people, oh, so-and-so got someone's name wrong, or their title is different now, and that's the first place reporters are going to go to double check that information. Or, at like a television station, someone who adds the name at the bottom, they're going to go and look for that information. So if it's correct there, it's more likely to be correct in the television story or in the newspaper. Knowing that it is important to respond to requests for information promptly. So if someone, emails you or calls you and says, I'm doing a story, I'm really looking to talk to someone about this or like this, and you don't know if you have that information right away, or it might take you some time, letting them know that is really helpful so they know whether they can potentially count on, something from you to help with the story or not, because otherwise they're kind of moving on, calling many people all at once. So just kind of that, I got your email, I got your call, this is not something we can help you with, or, we're looking to see if we can find someone that can speak about that is always appreciated. And I really encourage people to give feedback on stories. And also, if you see a story that you think was good but doesn't tell the whole story, suggesting a potential follow-up. And I know this is in the realm of, nobody has enough time to do the jobs that they have now. So how can we ask them to do even more jobs? And so clearly people can't do this stuff all the time. But when they have time or when they think it's important enough is the time that, I say if you can fit it in, you can help build a relationship, you can help change how, trauma is talked about in your community. If you know that a reporter has done a story with a family that you're working on, a family that you're working with, or the family has talked to them and there's a significant development, if you're able to, let the reporter know or let the family know how they can do that if they don't know. Again, kind of suggesting the next story, it's something you can say, you did a story on this family's experience, but what really I haven't seen anybody write about is how hard it is to access victims of crime funds. A lot of victims have problems, and here's the reason that families have problems getting this. So maybe suggest that larger story or a story with more context. If a television or news reporter makes a mistake, you have every right to request, and the family has every right to request that that mistake be corrected online, in print, and on air. Be real clear in letting the reporter know how you know the information isn't accurate, and also providing the accurate information. Most media entities will not print a correction unless they have the accurate information. So they can't just be told, so-and-so is not 28 years old. They have to be told they're actually 32 years old in order to correct it. If you don't get a response from someone who did a story, you should follow up with an editor and/or news director. It is absolutely essential that the media corrects its mistakes. They can only correct them, though, if they know that something is wrong. They might not hear it from anybody else, and they should be able to hear it from you. If you use social media channels and you see that a television station or a newspaper did a story on a survivor or a family in your community that was insightful and fair and accurate, consider sharing that to kind of promote things that work well. If you see one that really didn't sit well with you, consider either commenting on it in that realm or commenting on it as an agency if it really has crossed a line, or if it is a problem that you see in either that reporter or that news entity stories again and again. It's worth kind of standing up for victims and survivors and saying, we're not going to be discussed like this in your media, on your media platforms. If you have newspapers, it doesn't work as well for television, but sometimes they allow it. Writing letters to the editor where you can really use all of your own words to give your perspective and context can be helpful. I've seen some people very effectively and either gently or harshly correct misperceptions or point out folks that are doing a really good job of responding to survivors and their families. You know, I've seen people write letters saying, you know, such and such housing agency was not doing a great job before of dealing with families that have been through trauma, and they've changed their policies. And now we're seeing that our survivors and families who deal with them have a much better experience, and we just want to say thank you. Not every single one of those letters will be published, but it's good to get into the habit of writing them if someone at the agency or staff has time to do that now and again. I've had a couple agencies tell me that, you know, for every 5 letters they submit, maybe 2 get published. But the rest of them kind of go into a stack, and they also contribute to ideas for editorials and things like that. So it's a worthy habit if time allows. Building trust is always difficult, especially if sometimes we start out with experiences together that are not so great. As an agency, you can have kind of an engagement strategy. And I've seen a lot of people kind of confuse this with a marketing strategy. It's not quite the same way. The way that you're going to engage with reporters is going to be a little bit different than you're going to engage with the regular community. So one of the things that I really appreciate is when people at agencies that I work with kind of help me act as what I call an ear to the ground. They will start seeing patterns, problems, changes in either government or nonprofit systems that affect victims and families before I will, because they're dealing with lots and lots of people. I'm dealing with far fewer. So starting to hear about those things early gives me a chance to do reporting on them before they come out in official stats or kind of in a year-end report. And it also gives me more time to gather more resources and more sources to report on a story like that. Always, always, always good to reach out and talk about myths and misconceptions, about trauma. You know, any kind of incident that becomes, you know, what people refer to as kind of like a big media incident is always also an opportunity to talk about trauma and to include that in whatever conversation that you guys have with the media. I love it when sources send me studies or information pertaining to violent loss or homicide, and that's probably the wrong way to say that. I don't mean I love it, because I don't love that it happens, but I can't keep up with all of the most current research, even all of the statewide or local research. We have a lot of good colleges and universities that do work with our agencies here. So when folks forward me that study, it may not be something that I can write a story about at that exact moment, but it's something that I can use and fold into other stories to add context for the community. One of the things I've had folks do is ask me who they can talk to at other media outlets. That sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I think that reporters who do a good job tend to respect other reporters who do a good job. So I might have someone call me and say, you know, I have a survivor that wants to talk to a television station about something. Who do you think they can talk to that will treat their story appropriately? And I can give them a suggestion based on the topic of who I think might do a decent job with that type of story. Sometimes I'll even reach out and ask them and explain the situation so that they know that, you know, where the request is coming from and how it got to them. I think, you know, as a reporter who really takes seriously doing this work, I have found that people will reward you for treating people respectfully when they know that they have a story that has to be told with an incredible amount of sensitivity or open-mindedness or in a certain way. They will come to you, and I suggest that you guys do this if you have someone that you can trust. First and say, you know, instead of going out to everybody and kind of doing a press conference or a big interview, we're going to come and talk to you about this because we want to get all the details right, and it really matters to the survivor. The other benefit to this, if you have a story that you feel is going to get a lot of attention but could be incredibly difficult or sensitive, If you can go to someone, whether it be a print reporter or a really good online reporter, and get all the facts and details out there first, then the other media inevitably will follow along and get more of those facts and details right and get the tone right as well. This tip, actually the last one on the page, comes from the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center that I've dealt with for years. We used to go back and forth, myself and the development director there, about when media would call and try to ask to talk to a survivor, and she would get lots of calls from television stations for a specific survivor. And we were talking about it one time, and she said, well, it's not like we just have this like Rolodex of survivors who want to talk. And I said, well, the problem is you talk always about survivors, and so people always want to get closest. And there was a feeling that they wanted to shield those survivors from talking to the media, and that's understandable. But my response was, your mission is to empower survivors. So the way to empower them, would seem to be to give them the choice of whether they want to speak or not. And I think that's really been what I have done over the years, is said everybody who is a survivor, a family member, or victim needs to be able to make their own choice of whether they want to talk to the media about their story or their experience. And the best thing that everybody can do is help them make the right choice for themselves and not make it for them. And so they created a form for survivors who were done with their services. They did all the regular things to assess how well they were doing. But then they asked, do you want to share your story? Would you want to share it, in a private way? Would you want to share it in a semi-public way without using your name? Or would you be willing to share your entire story if a media outlet asked? And of course, survivors can change their mind at any time, but that really surprised them how many survivors who kind of got further into their healing were willing to share their stories. And that's really gotten a lot more survivor stories in the community. Let's see here, I'm going to go through these last ones quickly so we have time for Q&A. So timing really, really matters in the news. Offering stories to help the community learn about trauma when they're already focused on a high-profile case can be helpful. I have a kind of non-trauma example of, here in Cleveland, we were working on a whole lot of stories on lead poisoning that people were not all that interested in, even though we had a really significant problem. And then attention in the media turned on to what happened in Flint with poisoning in the water there. And all of a sudden, the stories were feeling a lot more important to people just because of that intense media focus. Ironically, even though Cleveland's lead poisoning problem was twice as bad as Flint's when the water crisis happened. So that just kind of shows you how important timing can be. If you have a case or a trial that's coming up, of course, we often don't know whether those cases are going to go to trial or whether they're going to plea. And there's expected to be some particularly difficult images of a victim or crime scene. That's a great time to remind media of the impact of showing those images. And also talking to people, prosecutors, courtroom folks, just ahead of time to think about how they are going to allow those images to be shown, knowing who could see them. There's definitely, rights that have to be respected in the trial phase, but what the community takes in is really important to consider. Also, during a high-profile type situation when media is trying to figure something out or dissecting something, having someone on your agency staff, especially if media calls and says, oh, I would like to talk to so-and-so, they're a victim or a family member, and that victim or family member does not want to participate, you can say, we can't do that because they don't want to participate, but we have Fran that works on our staff, and she's, an expert in this type of situation. Do you want her to come on and talk about what she knows? You can use that time to, dispel myths, bring up things that the media might not be talking about, or just kind of, again, be the conduit for what your staff is hearing from victims. The last part of this, and we could probably do just a whole different complete hour-long webinar on this because it's a complicated process, so I don't think that from this anyone would be able to just jump in and start doing this. But we in the media have realized, and a lot of other people have, and I think this is a good thing, that we are not the only people telling stories anymore. Agencies can tell their own stories. They can, cover their own events for victims and survivors. They can share those without even needing the media. They can support survivors in creating and telling their own truths and their own stories. And I have seen this done from different agencies, whether it's on, videos that are used on Facebook or on their own websites, where it's just as simple as kind of having a camera and having someone that's ready to tell their story in a tiny bit of technical experience, and it can be very powerful. Couple things to think about. Timing, is this the very beginning of someone's case? That might not be the time to tell kind of that longer, more personal tale. Oftentimes what I've seen is after someone has done some healing, that's a good time to share, what the trajectory of their experience was with people, that will help in a way that will help the community understand. Is a story that someone is trying to tell, is it a very personal story, or is it about a larger issue with a system that they had a problem with? So, a story about an unsolved case that a family really wants to see solved would be different than, a story where someone really felt that they were mistreated by the system. Also, taking some time to share positive experiences can be helpful. So if a survivor had a really great experience where the community supported them and they got help, they may want to talk about that and how that affected them. Also, I've seen a lot of survivors and families who want to make changes in the way police investigate cases, in the way cases are prosecuted, in the rights that victims and families do or do not have in the system, and in local or state policies and laws regarding victims. So if it's a story like that, it's a little bit more of a complicated story, but I think it's still possible to help a survivor or a family tell that story by helping them sketch it out and kind of hone in on the things that they think are important. I've seen that done even on Twitter by survivors who lay out in 10 tweets things about their experiences that helped them heal and that made it hard for them to heal, and shared that personal thing, and were very kind of buoyed by people sharing that and agreeing that they had that same common experience, or talk about ways to change that. I don't think survivor stories, especially when they're generated from a survivor, have to be perfect. Excuse me. They just need to be kind of clear, and they need to be really authentic and not overly kind of processed by anybody else. A survivor or a family member could take a short video, even with a phone, that can be shared. I've seen some really, really, really good personal videos taken on phones when someone feels comfortable. They're just in good light, and I think pretty much everyone in the world knows how to hold a phone to make themselves look more flattering than I do. Even my 14-year-old knows that. Helping that they have clear picture and sound, so they're in a quiet place and they can clearly see what they're trying to show. Sticking to one topic, idea, or theme. So again, if we're working with survivors and victims and family members, sometimes we tend to kind of hop around and kind of jump from an emotion to a part of a narrative. So kind of mapping that out a little bit first and sticking to something narrow. Sharing video of an action, so our family members going out and trying to drum up support to solve murders that are unsolved, or a specific murder that was unsolved, or to get more support for victims and survivors in the community. Are they doing something that you can take a video of and share? I would say to avoid press conferences or events pretty much always, unless it's a very, very powerful situation, or there's a very, very big thing happening. There's some easy online tools to use for editing. We use something called Videolicious, which is a very silly name, but it's a free tool you can download on your phone to quickly edit a video. And I am not the most technically savvy person, but I could figure out how to use it to edit and trim a video and add someone's name to it so I know who's speaking. Some other options for those that are really averse to video or afraid of it or just don't even have the time to learn that. I've seen some really good things with survivors where they had online photos of loved ones with quotes or of themselves with quotes about their situation, and also sharing letters and artwork and essays and things that they've already written, sometimes as part of their healing or some of their therapy. If they're comfortable sharing that, I think sharing some of those things with some context can be really, really powerful. So I did make it through all the slides in our time, and I have at least, I think, 15 minutes, or whenever you guys are going to end it, I can stay however long you need to, left for questions. I can answer things about specific situations, and I also can answer questions offline. I can make sure to provide my email if anyone has a specific situation they need help with or that they want to ask a question about.
All right, does anyone have any questions for Rachel? If so, please put them in our chat room or in the chat box, and I can read them out and we can go through that.
Yes, and I apologize immensely for speaking so quickly.
Beth Ann asked, would you be willing to provide a presentation to reporters in New York?
Sure, if they need one.
Yeah, Beth Ann, we can coordinate that through our grant. Since if they are stakeholders in the work that you do, we can make that work and maybe bring Rachel up to do a presentation. Other questions? And if you guys do have other questions that are very specific to the work that you do in your specific cities and with your site, then we can coordinate a time for us to have like kind of a technical assistance call with Rachel and the group here at NCVC. Yeah, and do we have any more questions? Going once, going twice.
And Tony, I'm happy to hear any feedback from anybody in terms of, what about a presentation like this is helpful? Are there parts of it not helpful? They can feel free to let me know as well.
Yeah, of course, and we'll also be sending out there will be a survey immediately after this, so you guys can provide feedback via that. Great, so if there are, where does Rachel teach? Rachel, you teach at Kent State, is that correct?
Yes, I teach at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio.
Excellent. Great, well, I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you guys so much for being patient with us today in the midst of our technical difficulties and for being just great at what you do. We will be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint and a recording of the audio from today's presentation. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me at tlarimore@victimsofcrime.org. Thank you guys
Tony,
so much.
Sorry. Tony, should I add my email and phone number to the presentation so they have it as well if they need it?
I'll send that out with it.
Okay, thank you.
Great. That concludes today's presentation. Thank you guys so much. We will be in touch with you guys in the future.